first.
Okay, Bill Streuver, Struever Brothers, Eccles and Rouse, and came here 30 years ago after graduating college. Two reasons. One, William Donald Schaefer was selling houses for $1 in the homesteading program, and my college roommate, Carver Eccles, my brother, Fred, could scrape $1 together between us. We thought it was a pretty cool idea. And secondly, my mom had just gotten a job teaching at Johns Hopkins, and we were able to work out a deal for a barter deal for room and board for in return for fixing up her new house. So that's how we got to Baltimore. And of course, once you're in Baltimore, you need a place to go for a beer. And the first Friday we were in town, my mom set us still in a place she knew, which was the Rathskeller at Johns Hopkins, and which is Friday night, 9 o'clock. Guys with sport jackets and ties on studying, which was not our image of Friday nights. Actually made us a little nervous about the decision to move to Baltimore, if that was the hot spot. But very quickly we learned about Fells Point. So that was our first acquaintanceship, and it's the best place to go for a beer in our fair city, and gave us new hope about the excitement and energy of our fair city. And
Now the dollar houses, they weren't in Fells Point, were they?
no, they weren't. They were actually the first big one was Sterling Street, the block, first consolidated group of dower houses up off of Gay Street and Old Town Mall, and but the second big one was over in Otterbein, which was freed up by the whole road change. So indirectly, the road fight led to the biggest of the homesteading efforts, which we did a lot of. We never got a dower house ourselves, never could get the dower together, but we did construction work for a lot of the homesteaders, both at Sterling Street and at the Otterbein. But coming to Baltimore was a return to Baltimore for my family, because two of my ancestors came through Baltimore. Both in the great tradition of America fugitives. One was an Irish fellow named James Hazlitt that was a captain in the English Army and was in one of the Irish revolts, failed revolts, as with most of the Irish revolts, and had to flee, so he came to Baltimore in 1795 and had a gun shop over on Water Street, and was a major in the militia in Battle of North Point. And then my other Baltimore ancestor was a French doctor from Haiti, and when the slave revolt, Toussaint was sweeping through the land, killing all the whites, he had, it was Louis Dunan, had saved the life of a young slave girl that had been badly burned, and the mom of the slave girl hid the good doctor and his fiancee, got him to the coast, and they came to Baltimore in 1803. And was an expert in yellow fever, and then the daughter of Hazlitt married the son of Dunan, and eventually they went out west and back through Rochester, and now back to Baltimore, hometown.
So you came here at the tail end of the road fight, you said?
Yeah, so that the first time we really, other than going to Fells Point to drink beer, which we did fairly regularly, was as the road fight was winding down and the houses were being freed up from the road. So kind of the beginning of new energy and the sense of a long-term future for Fells Point brought us down here in a way beyond beer drinking to see what the opportunity was here. And if you think about the things that really have changed the face of Baltimore as we know today, to me there's nothing more important than the road war. It's just an amazing story, and if you look at the devastation to cities across America by the big roads of the 50s and 60s and 70s, and the fact that we don't have a road, it truly has created so much of the opportunity that you see today in Baltimore, not just on the waterfront, but the ability to connect neighborhoods to the waterfront and the growth that comes out of the waterfront that is spreading through large parts of the city, because we don't have I-95, you know, blasting through Federal Hill Park, and the hill was going to be used for fill on the north side of the harbor, where the aquarium and I-70 was going to be an elevated road right where the aquarium is, and then the three roads, 83, 70, and 95, are going to meet in the world's largest cloverleaf, where Pier 6 and the Marriott waterfront are, and then head up, blasting through the Fells Point and Canton waterfront and up to New York. And just thinking, you know, in your mind's eye, how different the city would be if Judge Ward and Barbara Mikulski, and was a social worker at the time, and other valiant souls of the Fells Point Federal Hill Preservation Society that essentially were putting their families and their bodies in front of the bulldozers and doing those house tours, kind of squatting in the houses and doing house tours to demonstrate what a terrific resource these old houses were and are, and what a great neighborhood Fells Point is, and essentially defy the bulldozers and kill it. I mean, it's just such an amazing thing. So we don't have to spend $15 billion like they're spending in Boston on the Big Dig, and we're not stuck like Philadelphia is with I-95 dividing them off from their old industrial waterfront,
yeah,
which likely will be there forever, and truly diminishes in a big way their waterfront opportunity compared to ours. So we have this fantastic geography of our harbor kind of curling up into the bosom of our town, and the intimacy of our waterfront from side to side, and kind of the idiosyncrasies of the curves and of the waterfront makes it so much more fun and interesting than just about any other urban waterfront you can think of anywhere in the world. And of course, Fells Point's right smack in the middle of all that.
Can you give me a verbal snapshot of what Fells Point was like when you came here?
Well, there were a lot of boarded up houses from the road, you know, condemnation for the road. Industry was still here, though on its way out. Brown's Wharf, the Ruckerts were still operating there in a lesser way. Miller's Wharf was still standing and still being used. The Bond Street Wharf, which was Terminal Corporation, was still standing and being used. Allied Chemical was going strong in the 70s and puffing out whatever they were puffing out, and there were a number of smaller businesses. Walbrook Lumber had a millwork shop on Caroline Street that was still going. There was the Dryden Oil guys over where the ice skating rink is today. Atlantic Mill, which was this fantastic old wood frame lumber yard business, which you can think of, wood frame building, lumber business, fire trap, and of course it did burn, sadly, that had the most incredible collection of molding cutters. Must have had the cutters from every kind of molding known to mankind in there. I don't know whatever happened to them, whether the fire got them or what, but they still had a mill shop where you could get just about any kind of specialty molding you could dream of out of the place. So there was still what I would call active vestiges of Baltimore's maritime and industrial past still cooking in the 70s, and then in the next decade they quickly went by the wayside. So by the mid 80s, many of them were going to Allied Chemical closed shop in the late 80s, and by then most of everything else out on the Harbor Point Peninsula was gone. Constellation had bought the terminal warehouse, and Barry Levinson had done his movie and had his fake fire for Avalon in the terminal warehouse building, and Constellation then made the deal with the Preservation Society to transfer over the London Coffee House and George Wells House and return, and the Sugar Warehouse, which is now the Frederick Douglass Isaac Meyer Maritime Center, trading that for the right to tear down Bond Street Wharf and Miller's Wharf is kind of the deal. All that happened, I guess, in the mid to late 80s, so that by the early 90s, the industrial past was truly a past, and it's hard to think of anything significant left in Fells Point by then. I mean, there's still pieces left and are leaving now, like E.J. Cod just closed down after Isabel. Sadly, Meyer Seed's still there. Tugboats are still there, which is terrific, and I hope they stay forever. Hard to think what else is left. The old YMCA was closed, which is now the inn at the corner of Thames and Broadway.
Oh, right, that was the home for seamen.
Yeah, and you could walk through. I remember walking through the building. I think the city had bought it for the road, and it was vacant, and they were just beginning to put it out for bid in the early 80s when the road fight was finally, the last nail was driven in the road coffin. And I remember walking through, and you could see the tiny little rooms with little signs and stuff from when the sailors, drunken sailors, I guess, stayed at the Y. So that the little bit of a museum past.
So you came here and you got your start basically in Baltimore, and you've kind of grown as Baltimore and Fells Point have changed. Can you?
I think our company's history's really been built around the waterfront. We've done tons of stuff away from it, but we really began on the waterfront, and today our largest projects remain on the waterfront. The first home we bought, first project we had was in 1976, because by then we got a little impatient with doing work for other people. We were working on the dollar houses and wanted to do our own thing, and borrowed $10,000 from my mom and bought a house on the backside of Federal Hill on Grindle Street, looking out over the Key Highway shipyards and towards Fells Point, and fixed it up. And that was the beginning of our real estate business. And we finished the house. It was a beautiful little spot, and won the House of the Year award from the Maryland Contractors Association. We couldn't sell it because all the rest of the houses on the block were vacant, and a banker walked through and said, "What you got to do is fix up the whole block." And we said, "That's a great idea," but we'd spent my mom's 10 grand, and he said, "Well, you could borrow it." That's where we learned about leverage. That the great fuel of the real estate business is borrowing money. Mm-hmm. And we bought that block, and then we're hanging out at the Cross Street Market, and bought 40 storefronts around the market. And then since then, today, we projects all around the harbor, and obviously in Fells Point and Canton, here in Locust Point, and in South Baltimore. And the waterfront is magic. It's a terrific place. Our biggest project that we're doing is in Fells Point. We have 65 acres that we jointly control with John Pederakis, that essentially extends on the west from the Marriott Waterfront Hotel to Bond Street Wharf in Fells Point.
Now you think of that as part of Fells Point?
Well, actually, the original, as have been corrected many times, the original Fells Point was the Allied Chemical Harbor Point site. That was the point of Fells Point. And so we look at that area as kind of part of Greater Fells Point, Harbor East, Harbor Point, the original Fells Point, and the old Constellation properties, Fells Landing, and those three together, plus some infill properties that we have, comprises the 65 acres. We have approvals in place to build 7 million square feet of space on those 65 acres, which would, right now, the plan is to do a mixed-use combo of 2,500 hotel rooms and 2,000 housing units and 2 million square feet of office space and 1 million square feet of retail, restaurants and entertainment, and 8,000 structured parking places. It's about $1.75 billion, $1.75 billion of investment when it's fully built out. About 30% through the build out right now. Most of it's new construction, and one of the challenges and delights is to knit the density and largely new construction of the Harbor East, Harbor Point, and Fells Landing properties into the delightful character and spirit of the oldest part of the city in Fells Point, and doing it in ways like Bond Street Wharf, where we try to celebrate the spirit of Baltimore's pier buildings and industrial past, and took the kind of scale and character of the old terminal warehouse on Bond Street Wharf of the past and recreated it as a modern office building that works fantastic in the marketplace and is jammed full with important office tenants bringing lots of new jobs back to the neighborhood, and yet at the same time fitting into that kind of special character of Fells Point. Also in our planning, as we look at the public spaces and public infrastructure, as we lay out these 65 acres, trying to build on the idiosyncrasies of Fells Point, which everything's curving and twisted and not a lot of square corners in Fells Point. The tradition of the bigger, kind of more industrial maritime buildings on the water's edge with the smaller buildings set back in the neighborhood, creating delightful, interesting water spaces interacting with the land rather than just a boring, flat expanse of harbor's edge with a promenade. We're very much into recreating the piers and pier buildings of Fells Point's past. If you look at one of the old prints of Fells Point from the really back to the early 18th century through the 19th century and most of the 20th century, this was Fells Point interacting with the water with all these little buildings sticking out, creating these nifty spaces between them.
Yeah, I heard Peter Cavalucci's presentation for the homeowners.
Right, very, very much
yeah,
picking up
in fact,
on that.
We've been missing each other, but I have an appointment to interview him at some point to get him to give that talk again, because I thought it was really neat. I think the neighborhood has trouble describing itself in ways that an outsider can come in and describe itself.
Well, he had one thing that they picked up that just hadn't occurred to me is the plans, the Notter plan for Fells Point that was later adapted into urban renewal plan, established this concept of low buildings on the water's edge and higher buildings farther away. And Stan Eckstedt and Peter said, what's this all about? I mean, let's look at what's here. The biggest buildings are on the water's edge, these fantastic pier buildings. And at the time, the city had a policy, no pier buildings, that they wanted just to have a flat edge of fast land. And you might be able to have little marina slips out there, but no buildings. This is not at all the tradition of Baltimore's harbor. What it is the biggest building sticking out in the water, kind of defining the interaction, this marvelous interaction between water activity, and the land. Whether it's the Continental Can, now Canton Cove, Tindeco Wharf, Henderson's Wharf, Wreck Pier, the old terminal warehouse at Bond Street Wharf, Domino Sugar, Tide Point. The biggest buildings in those neighborhoods were the ones in the water, so to speak. And
well, this is maybe
it's really a refreshing perspective that we, oh God, we hadn't, like the light bulb went on.
This is maybe a way to get into another topic that I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about. Because I know various people that worked on that urban renewal plan, you know, had a personal investment in it and bought into this concept of low buildings by the water. And you probably got a number of scars and at least, you know, put a fair amount of resources into working with the neighborhood, trying to, you know, work all these things through. What can you, as a developer, what's it like working with the Preservation Society and these neighborhoods, especially Fells Point?
Well, you have to love Fells Point. It's kind of a little bit like with New Hampshire's "Live Free or Die." I mean, it's this effervescent spirit and curmudgeonly energy of people like Ed Kane and Bob Keith and the China's Steve Bunker that aren't always the easiest people to deal with at times. As you talk about plans and new development, that truly love their neighborhood and feel in their hearts what's so important and precious about this kind of you had your words in your little thing there, idiosyncratic kind of funkiness, little odd shapes and all different kinds of people. And you know, if you talk about Jane Jacobs and what I think is one of the best stories of urban neighborhoods in America, Life and Death of Great American Cities, you know, her whole thing was density and diversity, and loved telling stories of these kind of weird mixings and matchings of peoples and uses together. And Fells Point really celebrates the best of that kind of urban spirit that Jane Jacobs talks about, where you do have, you know, the old sailboat guy, tugboat guys, you know, operating right next to some kind of fancy home furnishing boutique and restaurant, and then a pub where all the locals hang out, all that kind of, and you have Morgan Stanley and Brown Investment Advisors and a ton of Johns Hopkins people sitting in Bond Street Wharf coming there just because their delight in being part of such a interesting neighborhood. So working with Fells Point is always is never a boring moment, but you have to love it to do it.
Gee, that was nice.
you have to. If you don't like it, you shouldn't be in Fells Point. That's my perspective. So I've never, even though from time to time I've been pilloried as being a fat cat evil developer, I've always respected and appreciated the perspective that those sometimes cranky folks bring to the table, because that's what makes Fells Point that. I think we've done fairly well in working with them over the years, because I would like to think that we've developed a respect back and forth, because while we may disagree on specific issues like this issue of, you know, height, where should height be? It should be low in the water, high in the water, low behind, high behind. But hopefully a sense that we're approaching what we think really fits with Fells Point. And they may think a little differently. We argue it out, and I think by and large have done pretty well in coming up by the end with a better plan than we thought of, and a better plan than maybe the community might have thought of. Harbor Point's a terrific example. When the neighborhood started sitting down with Allied Chemical, we were brought in by Jim Rouse, who had been invited in by Allied Chemical to look at this site. What should we do? The plant had closed down. They had just done the consent decree with Maryland Department of Environment and EPA. We're going to be spending $90 million cleaning it up. And the folks at Ally were saying, what should we do with this? The easy thing to do, and what a lot of these big multinational companies do, is they just put a fence around these sites and it's easy, you don't have to worry about liability, just be done with it. And Allied had a little bit of inkling that this was too important a site just to put a fence around. And that's why they went to Jim Rouse. Is there something that we should, some higher and better use that we should be thinking about, this incredible peninsula that sticks into Baltimore's harbor, the original Fells Point. So that Allied came into a little bit of trepidation. What can we do with this thing? The neighbor came in and said, well, this should just be, you can't really do anything. We don't want anything out of there. Shouldn't be any buildings out there. If we do anything at all, it should just be a park, the whole thing. And went through this whole 2-year-long process and meeting after meeting. One, getting people comfortable that there was a way, once the remediation was done, to safely and responsibly put the site back into productive use and not just let it sit there. And that total buy-in by everybody that this was, the fantastic site of Baltimore, of the East Coast, and that if there ever was going to be a Sydney Opera House type icon for Baltimore, that people around the world would see and say, oh, that's Baltimore, coolest place ever. The place to put that, whether it was Sydney Opera House or if you're looking for a place to put Statue of Liberty, would be out the Harbor Point. Everybody bought into that, and give and take back and forth, and ended up almost half the land is going to be park. That was the deal that was made. 11 acres out of the 20-some acres at Harbor Point will be forever park, promenade, and public use space. And at the same token, that it was too important a site to leave it at that, and that the community bought into 1.8 million square feet of buildings, including buildings as tall potentially as 180 feet in the center of the site, because if we're going to be able to attract world headquarters of buildings to Baltimore, which Baltimore desperately needs to rebuild its economy and its job base, what better place to attract them to than this fantastic site, the original Fells Point at Harbor Point. So that, to me, is a wonderful story of kind of the coming together, starting at very different points, perspectives between the community, developer, property owner, and come together with what I would like to think that everybody involved in the process agree was a much better plan than anybody had ever started with. Out of the
Going back to your comment about Fells Point, I'm trying not to interrupt because I don't want to stop you, but your comment about Fells Point having all these interesting types of diversity and people being drawn there because of it. I think one of the fears of the people that we've interviewed is that as the value of the property goes up, you have the potential to drive some of these people out. Like Steve Bunker, he says the reason he left, he couldn't afford to do business here anymore. Is there a realistic concern about that? I think, you're more of an optimist and you're more of a visionary than some of the people we've interviewed. How do areas like Fells Point deal with that? How can they maintain, their individuality?
I mean, how boring it would be if we had nothing but Home Depot and Staples and boring old national retailers and a bunch of fancy people living in condos and stuff like that, which would be truly be a huge loss, because I think one of the reasons why people like Morgan Stanley, Brown Investment Advisor, Hopkins love moving their businesses into Baltimore and having it on the harborfront is because of that very diversity and authenticity of that Fells Point in its very essential sense its people is. So I would talk about the concern about people beginning pushed out or forced out or encouraged out into a couple different groups. One's the merchants, because I think it's a great definer of urban America, downtowns, urban neighborhoods like Fells Point, is the fact that it isn't the same old gang of Gap, Banana Republic that's in every mall across America, that you do have these homegrown local places that are very special and different. And certainly rents do go up over time. You spend a lot of money fixing up the building, building a new building. You can't make it work at $8 rents. You need $18 rents. it's certainly our belief, and I think the evidence is there in many cases to show that these established local Fells Point, Canton neighborhood merchants need new business to be able to grow, because their old business is gone. All the people, the hundreds of jobs that used to be at Allied Chemical and that when Record Terminals was down here and we're Terminal Corporate, they're all gone. Population is generally lower, and they need new bodies around them, whether it's people living in the neighborhood to shop, people coming to visit the shop, or people that work there to come and shop or have a beer after work or eat lunch, buy a cup of coffee in the morning. That those that really want to stay and want to adapt, the opportunity is only bigger, and that there's enough more business for them so that if rents go over a 10-year period from $8 to $18, they can make more money at the $18 because there's twice or three times the number of people, customers around for them to do it. There's more of a critical mass of quality merchants around for them to support each other and make it worth people to come down. So I do think that those merchants, and I think Steve Bunker could have stayed. He and I disagreed, and but that you know, his shop's one that would do even better as time went on with more people around, more foot traffic, just more density of activity around. I think same thing with the kind of the bar scene. The nature of the bar scene may change. The bar scene used to be sailors. They're all off, not sailors off sailboats, but sailors off ships. They're gone by and large. And then it was college kids. I think the nature of the bar business changed, and I think not necessarily a bad change to be made. For the residents, is a whole other kind of dimension to the gentrification issue and rising prices. Gentrification is the gentry coming in and chasing out the non-gentry. I get it. It's the slogan for rising values and people either choosing to leave that have been there or being forced to leave because of rising prices. Those that own can stay. The city has this 4% cap on property taxes, so if you lived in Fells Point in 1985 and owned your home and it was assessed at $50,000, the most your taxes could go up is $4 a month, because that's 4%. You know, it's the way the state property tax lid works, so that homeowners really, I think there's a lot of misperception around rising values, and there's a lot of benefits to the city of rising values, because as values don't go up, tax rates are never going to go down in the city, and the city suffers mightily from tax rates that's double any other jurisdiction in the state of Maryland, and the city desperately needs new revenues to pay for schools and police, fire, libraries, and all those services that make for a great city. So values going up is a good thing. People are concerned about the downside of that, an impact on low and moderate income families. If you own your home, it shouldn't be a big deal. If you rent, it's a much bigger problem with raising rents. And luckily there is continuing efforts to do affordable rental housing in what, not necessarily in Fells Point itself, but not far away. You know, projects like Broadway Homes up at the old Church Home Hospital Flag House. Perkins is going to stay affordable, so that there are nearby a substantial amount of housing that's affordable to very low income families. The whole issue of artists, you know, artists and those interesting folks that kind of the pioneers of the neighborhoods like Fells Point or you know, Eastern Avenue and Highlandtown and different parts of Baltimore and different cities around the country. We are eager to find ways so that they don't end up getting tossed out as soon as the neighborhood gets better. They go into these tough neighborhoods help make it an exciting, attractive neighborhood. All these other people move in and costs go up and they move out. So we're excited about things like the Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance, the Patterson Theater, where they're creating permanently through cooperative ownership space that will always be affordable to artists. We're doing that up at Clipper Mill in the Jones Falls Valley. We're doing an artisans co-op of 50,000 square feet. We're doing it in Providence with my daughter and a bunch of her friends, where we're creating affordable live workspace using historic texture and stuff, where they will control it forever as long as they want to and can pay their rent, which is a very modest rent.
What's in it for you as a developer to do that?
What's in it is the value created by again, density and diversity is what makes these neighborhoods so special, and having a vibrant arts community, having really cool and locally owned merchants like Steve Bunker or Sukasa, who's another local guy, makes it a better, more attractive, to me, a much more exciting neighborhood. Whether we're trying to market office space or for sale housing, rental housing, that's what's in it for us. Is that having the Patterson up there, not that we've done anything to help them, they've really done that by themselves and with a whole host of other people that have, Barbara Mikulski and others that got them funding. It's a wonderful amenity for the community.
Let's talk a little bit about development generically, and I'd like, speaking as a developer, I think you have a different perspective, but I'd like you to take yourself out of the picture, because from what you've said and from what everybody has told me, people like you guys. You're not the bad guy most of the time, but there are other developers that people are not so friendly about, and I've heard some of our interviews.
Well, the evils of development and the perils of planning. I would agree that the city in the past has suffered from a sense of desperation, perhaps, about the need for investment, so that anybody that came along with a plan and a promise to do something, the city, perhaps more so than it should, was kind of a reactionary kind of position, where what can we do to make it happen, rather than thinking big picture and kind of highest best use and what's in the larger view best interests of the community and the city as a whole. And one of the best examples of this kind of, to me, lack of confidence and aspiration of our city, which is the biggest issue the city faces, is it's a crisis of spirit, of self-confidence about what we can become. And because if we truly believe that our city can be a great American city once again, I believe that if we all come together in a collaborative effort, we can do anything. I mean, as a broad community, we can solve any of the challenges that face us. But it really begins with self-confidence and kind of a spirit. We can go out and do it. That was one of the things Schaefer was great at, and I think O'Malley is hard at work to reinvigorate that self-confidence. One of the best examples of lack of self-confidence is with how we deal with parking. Cars are one of the great evils of the cities, and have caused huge issues with kind of urban America and really cities around the world. And Baltimore, in its desperation to accommodate cars, rather than what some other cities done, look much bigger in transit, which is where the business community, the planning community, community come together and said, we need to do something about transit. Baltimore just didn't do that until very recently with the regional rail plan, and instead kind of took the short-sighted view. We need parking, we need cheaper parking, how can we subsidize parking? And ended up with a lot of really ugly, poorly situated above-ground garages. I mean, we're building a parking garage right on the harbor. I mean, what city in the world would put a parking garage right on the waterfront like we're doing?
Cleveland.
Cleveland, okay. And some of these garages that I think are poorly situated are ones that I'm embarrassed to say that we built. We built every time I come down Pratt Street, see the garage we built for somebody, we don't own it, but for somebody else, right at Little Italy there, that should not be a garage there. So I think that's an example of a reflection of the frustration that we've heard from the Fells Point community, that the city is, in the past at least, was too willing to just take whatever they can get on the basis that they're so desperate for investment, so desperate in this case for parking, that they'd compromise the standards of urban design and put a garage where it shouldn't be. On the garage end, we're trying to show there's a better way to do it. In Fells Point, we just finished a 750-car garage, and our goal is to make it invisible. We're going to totally surround it on all sides by housing. Some of it fixing up old stuff like the George Wells and London Coffee House, which we bought from the Preservation Society. Some of it with condos or townhouses. So other than the big P sign and a little hole that you can drive through into the garage, you don't know our garage is there, which to me is kind of a reflection, kind of a larger view towards the development that I think the city's beginning to move down that path. The interest in having a larger vision reflected in having the Roberts master plan that was just completed for the city is another example of kind of that larger view. In terms of advice for, this is, speaking as an evil developer to the neighbor, how to work with us evil developers. I've always been a great believer that the best approach is an open, collaborative process that's focused and disciplined. Because time's money for everybody, and money has choices about where it goes, and the city desperately needs. Hopefully, there's a starting point where there's universal agreement. The city needs reinvestment. It needs new jobs. It needs new population. If it continues to lose jobs and population, losing tax base, the future is a desolate one indeed, because tax rates will only go up and more people will keep leaving, and we'll never be able to provide great schools and libraries and all the wonderful services that we want. So if we agree that the starting point is the need for investment, then hopefully people are coming together in a way of saying, I'm not just against development, any development, no matter what the development is, forever, but I'm willing to sit down and work through, come up with a plan that makes sense, and do it in a way where we're, as a incredibly diverse community that Fells Point represents, with a dozen different organizations for its different factions and of businesses and residents, to force itself, which is what the Fells Point Task Force is all about, which is terrific, to convene in one place the leadership of all those organizations and create a communication mechanism, so that as issues come up, as plans and work to move forward, the community can engage in a way that a developer, a city agency person doesn't have to, every time they go to a meeting, deal with a whole new group of folks going over the same issues for the 5th time. And every time you think you've worked out a agreement as to a plan, a height of a building, density, a use, they have to retread that ground because somebody new came in and said, well, even though those guys agreed to it, I don't like it, and we're going to start over again. It's hugely important for the community as a whole to create a process that's rational, disciplined, and focused, so that doesn't happen. And I think the task force is a long way to do it. The process we went through with Allied Chemical, where you had the same group sitting down week after week, working step by step through all the issues of a big, complicated project like that, worked well. We did the same thing with Fells Landing, did the same thing, beginning to do the same thing around the public spaces at Harbor Point in terms of how we engage with the community on that. So it's our hope that Fells Point can continue doing what it is doing, keep its very special spirit, its crankiness, and individualism, and yet at the same time balance that with the big picture and a sense of obligation to the city as a whole in terms of what Fells Point and its waterfront can contribute to the city as a whole. It's the front gate to its biggest employer, 10 blocks up the street at Hopkins Medical Campus. That's a big responsibility for Fells Point in terms of the role it plays for everybody in our fair town, for that matter, for our state, since Baltimore is so hugely important to the vitality and prosperity of our region and state. I hope and expect Fells Pointers to continue, and that this evolving tradition of cranky collaboration that I think's been effective, where people are always free to speak and say their mind, but are willing to stick to a deal, are willing to move forward, are willing to compromise, are willing to listen to fresh perspectives like the one Peter Cavalucci and Stan X said about, hey, maybe the water's edge should have buildings on piers. That's the history of Fells Point. Maybe those buildings should be bigger than some of the buildings behind them, because that's the history of Fells Point. So I hope that kind of listening goes. With that comes the issue of density and how you deal with density and congestion. And one of the ironies is the greatest believers in smart growth in our cities also often become the greatest opponents of density, and yet density is the name of the game of what it's the J&J. Density and diversity is what cities are all about, and to some extent, some congestion's a good thing. It reflects that there's people working, people living, people wanting to be there, and not that you like being stuck in traffic, but if you could get right through the middle of town and drive around the harbor in 2 minutes without hitting any traffic, that'd be pretty spooky. Because that would mean you might as well turn the lights off on Baltimore. And the fact that it's a little bit harder to get around is, I think, to some extent goes with the territory. Congestion is an issue. One of the biggest challenges for Baltimore is transit. I think the cities that are going to prosper in the next 20 years in America will be those with viable rail-based transit systems. Baltimore doesn't have one. It has a couple little fragments. It now has a plan for a regional rail system. Unfortunately, it's a little late, and given the environment in Annapolis and in Washington, it's much more difficult to see how the billions of dollars that are going to be needed to really to graduate our fragmented rail system to an effective rail system is tough. But the plan's there. The red line that would connect east to west from Camden Yards across the top of the harbor into Fells Point, connecting up to Hopkins Medical Campus, it's all there. And I think, to me, as we look at traffic congestion, we should be working even harder on transit. And that's coming up with things like Harbor Tran, Bob Embry's little scheme for kind of a nifty little trolley system on the north side of the harbor. The water taxi should be transit. We have the best opportunity for water taxi truly being a convenient, fun way to get around, and not just a tourist thing, of any waterfront community in the country, because it's so compact. Unlike London, there's no tunnels or bridges underneath it. You have to go all the way around. And the quickest way to get to Fells Point from Dive Point is to go right across the harbor. And that's why we are partnering and subsidizing with the water taxi, the service back and forth. That's why we have the Canton Kayak Club, so you can paddle back and forth. So that would be my pitch on the density issue, is not to blindly say that density bad. Density is a good thing. Density is what creates the market that's going to support the merchants, that's going to support the amenities that desperately need to make all this work. Density is what's going to create the tax base that we need to pay for the service. Density in the end was really kind of the essence of cities. So let's not try to kill projects just for the sake of killing density. Let's look at density in a creative way and how we can mitigate the downside of density, whether it's let's mitigate buildings that are totally out of whack and scale to little 2- and 3-story historic buildings. Let's try to do things that are more in context with around them, and let's figure out how to make the traffic work and get transit to get people out of their cars, so this all can hang together. And actually, one of the best ways to get around is walking, and that was Schaefer's genius, to give him, you know, credit. The old Jim Rouse, when you have lemons, you make lemonade. When he got killed on the road, so what am I going to do with this? You know, I got a defunct industrial maritime waterfront, and somehow came up with the idea that, hey, this waterfront is an incredible magical resource, and launched the idea of the 7.5-mile promenade as forever being reserved for the public. And this incredible notion that the waterfront should be the great meeting place in our society, and it is to this day. I mean, anybody and everybody is comfortable on our harbor. Rich people, poor people, black people, white people, city people, suburb people. That's the great meeting place. Schaefer had the idea. Everybody in the world's now come and seen our promenade, and gone back and done it in their waterfront cities. And it's high time to get our promenade, after almost 30 years since Schaefer launched the idea, get the doggone thing done. And I think it will actually, in fact, get done sometime soon. So that's more schools. We could talk about schools forever, but that's another thing. I got to run, unfortunately.